The note is barely larger than a playing card, folded twice, pushed into a tin cylinder, and buried under a pile of stones on the northwest coast of a frozen island. For 13 years, nobody in the world knows this paper exists. When a search party finally pries it open in 1859, the handwriting crowded into its margins tells them something they had spent over a decade refusing to fully believe. Every man who sailed on this expedition is dead, and the dying had started almost a year before anyone wrote a single word about it. 2 ships left England in May 1845 to find a path through the Arctic ice that no European vessel had ever sailed start to finish, the long-sought Northwest Passage joining the Atlantic to the Pacific through a maze of frozen channels north of Canada. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were, by the standards of their day, the best-equipped polar ships the Royal Navy had ever sent north. Reinforced hulls braced with iron. Steam engines adapted from railway locomotives, ready to push the vessels forward when the wind alone could not. 3 years of food packed into the holds, a library of more than 1,000 books, and a commander who had already crossed this same frozen coastline once before and lived to write about it. Below decks, in the months before any of this began, the library held everything from naval manuals to popular novels, and the men had access to a hand organ that could be wound to play 50 different tunes, a small mechanical comfort against months of darkness nobody aboard yet imagined would stretch on quite as long as it eventually did. 129 men sailed west past Greenland that summer, after 5 others, judged too weak for what lay ahead, had been sent home from a brief stop at Disco Bay. A whaling crew anchored near Baffin Bay watched the 2 ships wait for a gap in the pack ice, then push through it in late July, the crews exchanging letters and news across the water while moored to a passing iceberg. No European ever reported seeing them alive again. There is more here for you, if you would like it. If you find a place like this one, quiet, patient, built for the long dark of a winter night, consider subscribing, so the channel can keep finding you when you need it most. And for those who would like a little more, channel members receive early access to every documentary before it appears here, and a quiet way to support the slow work these stories take to make. Sailors of this era understood the Arctic mainly through stories passed down from earlier voyages, second-hand accounts of ice and cold that, however vivid, could never quite prepare a man for the specific, grinding reality of actually living through it himself. Franklin's own crew had heard these stories too, told and retold during the long Atlantic crossing, never imagining how closely their own voyage was about to come to matching them. The Royal Navy chasing this same stretch of frozen water had a history stretching back nearly 300 years before Franklin ever set foot aboard Erebus. Martin Frobisher tried it in the 1570s and came home with a hold full of rock he believed was gold, rock that later turned out to be worthless. Henry Hudson tried in 1610, and his own starving crew eventually set him adrift in a small open boat with his young son, never to be seen again by anyone. By 1845, the blank, unmapped space on the chart had narrowed to a single uncertain stretch of channels, small enough that the Admiralty genuinely believed one final, well-prepared push would finish the job for good. Decades of earlier voyages, several of them led by Franklin himself in his younger years, had already mapped most of this same Arctic coastline piece by piece, narrowing the unknown gap year after year until only one final, uncertain stretch of channels remained for any expedition brave enough or confident enough to finally attempt it. Tonight, though, we go back to the ice. What happened to those 129 men would not be fully understood for well over a century, pieced together slowly through this single folded note, through bones scattered across a frozen coastline, and through testimony that took the rest of the world far too long to take seriously. We follow that story now, from a confident departure to a silence nobody could explain, into a grave dug into frozen gravel, and finally, more than 150 years later, down to 2 wrecks resting quietly on the Arctic seafloor. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old when he took command, and he already carried a story the Royal Navy preferred not to repeat too loudly in polite company. 20 years earlier, on an overland expedition along the same general stretch of Arctic coast, his men had run out of food so completely that they resorted to eating the leather of their own boots, and several of them did not survive to tell the story at all. Franklin had survived. He came home, was promoted, was knighted, and the nickname that followed him quietly through London drawing rooms for the rest of his life was the man who ate his boots, a label that was half admiration and half warning, depending on who was telling the story and how much wine had been poured. That history did not stop the Admiralty from giving him 2 ships in 1845. If anything, it gave them confidence. Here was a commander who had already met the worst the Arctic could offer and had still found his way home, a man whose failures, paradoxically, made him seem like the safest possible choice for an expedition meant to finally close the last unmapped gap in the Northwest Passage. A junior officer who had served under him on that earlier overland march once described watching Franklin kneel beside a dying companion in the snow and pray with him for nearly an hour, refusing to let the column move forward until it was over, a story that traveled through the Navy long before the man himself ever set foot back in the Arctic. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were prepared with a thoroughness that reflected exactly how seriously the Admiralty took this final attempt. Both ships carried internal iron bracing designed to resist the slow, grinding pressure of pack ice closing around a hull, the kind of pressure that had crushed lesser vessels in earlier decades. The holds were packed with tinned meat, flour, salted pork, and lemon juice carried specifically against scurvy, a disease the Navy had spent the better part of a century learning to fear and, it believed, learning to prevent. By the 1840s, the Admiralty had spent decades steadily narrowing this same blank stretch of Arctic coastline, decade after decade of earlier voyages mapping a little more of the shoreline each season, until only one final, uncertain gap remained between everything already charted and a complete, confirmed Northwest Passage. Franklin's expedition was meant to close that single remaining gap for good, and very few people in London in 1845 seriously doubted that it would. Below decks, a library held everything from naval manuals to popular novels, and a hand organ, wound by hand, could be set to play any of 50 different tunes, a small mechanical comfort against months of darkness nobody aboard expected to need for quite as long as they eventually would. The ships paused at Disco Bay on the Greenland coast to take on fresh water from a glacier-fed stream, and it was here that the last letters anyone aboard ever sent reached English shores. One officer wrote to his sister that the ice ahead looked thinner than expected, that the season seemed unusually promising, and that he hoped to be home again by the following autumn. Both ships carried their own histories long before Franklin ever stepped aboard either one. HMS Terror had survived shelling at the Battle of Baltimore in 1814, the very same bombardment that inspired the lyrics to a future national anthem, before later being converted into a bomb vessel and finally into a polar exploration ship reinforced specifically for ice. HMS Erebus had already carried a previous expedition through pack ice far colder and far more remote than anything in the Northern Hemisphere, returning home with its hull fully intact and its reputation, among officers who had served aboard it, as one of the toughest and most dependable vessels anywhere in the fleet. Neither ship had ever lost a single man to ice before 1845, and that unbroken record is part of why so few people in London worried, in the first year or two of silence, that anything had genuinely gone wrong. The remaining 129 men sailed on from that anchorage, west into the channels and straits of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and somewhere in the weeks that followed, between the last sighting near Baffin Bay and the silence that came after it, this expedition crossed into a part of the Arctic that would not let any of them leave again. The first winter looked nothing like a disaster. Erebus and Terror anchored near a small island called Beachy, off the coast of Devon Island, and the crews settled into the kind of routine that polar expeditions had spent decades perfecting. A printing press carried aboard ship turned out a small newspaper for the men to read by lamplight. The officers staged a theatrical performance during the darkest weeks of the season, taking turns at the female roles to a packed and laughing audience of their own crewmates, because morale mattered just as much as food when the sun did not rise above the horizon for months at a time. The Canadian Arctic archipelago itself is a maze of islands separated by narrow channels, most of them locked under ice for 10 months of any ordinary year. Even during the brief summer window when at least some channels might clear, the ice does not always cooperate, and some years it barely shifts at all. A ship caught in the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment can find itself frozen in for an entire winter it never planned for, sometimes for 2 winters running. The Royal Navy had stocked these ships with lemon juice specifically to prevent scurvy, a disease that builds slowly through vitamin deficiency, beginning with swollen gums and old wounds that refuse to close, and ending, in its worst stages, in internal bleeding severe enough to kill a man outright. Whether that supply of juice retained its full protective strength across the unplanned, multi-year ordeal that was coming is one of the genuine open questions historians still argue over today, since vitamin C degrades steadily once a container has been opened and exposed to air, and nobody alive now can say with real certainty how much protection actually remained in those bottles by the expedition's 3rd winter trapped in ice. 3 men did not make it through that first season at all. John Torrington was 20 years old. John Hartnell was 25. William Brain was 32. They were buried in the frozen gravel of Beechey Island beneath wooden headboards that still stand on that island today, weathered but legible if you crouch close enough to read them. Hartnell's own brother, who served alongside him aboard Terror, helped carry the coffin to the gravesite and carved the headboard himself, choosing a line from the Book of Haggai for the inscription, "Consider your ways." Nobody standing at that gravesite in January 1846 could have guessed how literally future researchers, working more than a century later with tools nobody on that island could have imagined, would eventually take those words. There is a particular kind of cold that polar veterans describe quite differently from ordinary winter weather, a cold that settles into the body and never fully leaves, even indoors, even close beside a stove. Arctic temperatures during the worst stretches of a winter like this one could fall to -40 degrees, cold enough that exposed metal turned dangerously brittle, cold enough that bare skin could freeze within a matter of minutes, cold enough that a man's own breath crystallized into a fine frost on his beard before he had walked even 20 paces across the open deck. The ships were heated, after a fashion, by coal-fired stoves carried in the hold, but warmth aboard a wooden vessel locked in ice spreads unevenly at best. Officers' quarters stayed reasonably comfortable. The lower decks, where most of the ordinary crew slept stacked close together in hammocks, often did not, and men woke some mornings to find frost had quietly formed on the inside of the hull beside them overnight. No one aboard those ships understood, that quiet winter, that these 3 early deaths were a warning of what the Arctic still had waiting for the rest of them. The expedition sailed on when the ice broke apart in the spring of 1846, moving west and then south, toward a stretch of water no European ship had ever crossed, and toward the place where both vessels would finally stop moving altogether. By September 1846, Erebus and Terror were beset, locked fast in pack ice off the northwest coast of King William Island, and they would not move again. Crews got beset by ice constantly in this era of polar exploration, and it was rarely fatal on its own. You waited out the winter, the spring thaw arrived on schedule, and the ice released its grip the way it had always done before. The first winter at Beechey had been hard but entirely manageable. This one, the men likely assumed, would unfold the same way. It did not. The ice held through 1847. It held through the following winter as well, an entrapment lasting far longer than anyone aboard had reasonably planned for, stretching provisions calculated for 3 years thinner with every additional month the ships stayed locked in place. Hunting parties went out across the broken ice looking for seal, for caribou, for anything at all that might supplement what remained in the hold, and they returned again and again with almost nothing, Because this particular stretch of coastline offered little to men who had never learned to read its specific seasonal rhythms the way the families who actually lived and traveled across this same landscape seemed to manage without apparent difficulty. At first, this likely felt entirely survivable to the men trapped aboard. Ships got beset by ice constantly during this era of polar exploration, and it was rarely fatal on its own. You simply waited out the winter. The spring thaw arrived as it always had, and the ice eventually released its grip the way it had done for every expedition before this one. The first winter at Beachy had been difficult but entirely manageable. This second entrapment, the men aboard likely assumed, would unfold the very same way. Sir John Franklin died aboard ship on June 11, 1847. The only surviving written record states this single fact and nothing more. No cause given, no description of his final days, no indication of whether his death came suddenly or slowly. Command passed to Francis Crozier, an Irish officer who had spent more years in polar ice than almost anyone else then serving in the Royal Navy, a quiet, steady man who had proposed marriage to a woman in England before this voyage and been turned down, and who would never get the chance to ask her again. The crew who served under him across the years described someone who rarely raised his voice, who knew most of his ordinary sailors by name rather than only his fellow officers, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone else aboard, exactly how thin the line really was between a hard Arctic season and a fatal one. Some historians have speculated, cautiously, that Crozier's own background may have shaped how he ultimately handled this final crisis, that a man less personally invested in rigid naval hierarchy for its own sake might have proven more willing to make pragmatic, even somewhat unconventional decisions once bare survival, rather than protocol, became the only thing that genuinely mattered anymore. There is no surviving record to confirm or deny this particular theory directly. What we have instead is simply the outline of his final, documented choices, holding the expedition together for as long as he reasonably could manage, then choosing to lead the march south himself rather than sending others ahead in his place, a decision broadly consistent with everything his earlier career had always suggested about the kind of officer he had quietly tried to be. By April 1848, with both ships still trapped and the situation no longer survivable wherever they sat, Crozier made the decision that would define everything that followed. Abandon the ships. Walk south. And somewhere in the hours surrounding that decision, with 105 men now remaining out of the original 129, someone sat down and wrote the only message this expedition would ever leave behind for the rest of the world to eventually find. You are standing on pack ice in April 1848, watching 105 exhausted men prepare to walk away from the only shelter any of them have left. Before they go, someone takes a printed Admiralty form, the standard kind meant to be sealed in a bottle and dropped overboard at sea, the sort of paper that exists purely so that, if found, it can tell a stranger where a ship has been. Someone has used the narrow margins of this page to write something considerably more important than any routine position report. Somewhere nearby, the ships themselves sat silent in the dark, their decks coated in frost, their holds nearly emptied of anything still useful. The men working outside in that failing light were not thinking about history, or about what future researchers might eventually make of this single sheet of paper. They were thinking, almost certainly, about the next day's march, and about how many of them would still be walking by the time the light failed again. You can picture the scene easily enough. Cold hands holding a pen steady against the wind. A man crouched low against the side of a half-buried boat, using whatever shelter the ice offered, writing quickly because the light was already failing and because there were still supplies to organize before the next morning's departure. The first lines on this page were written a full year earlier, in May 1847, and they say almost nothing at all. All well. Wintered at Beachy. Sailed on. A routine, almost cheerful update from a confident expedition, signed by James Fitzjames, the 32-year-old captain of Erebus, an ambitious and well-liked officer whose career was supposed to be just beginning rather than quietly ending on a coastline he had never expected to see twice in one lifetime. Around those same original lines, a different hand has now added what actually happened in the year since. The ships were deserted on April 22nd. Franklin had been dead since the previous June. 9 officers and 15 men had already died by the time this note was written, a death toll that, on a crew this size, meant nearly 1 in 5 men were already gone before the march south had even begun. The note names Crozier as the new commander and states that the 105 survivors intend to start walking the very next day toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland, several hundred kilometers across some of the most exposed and barren terrain anywhere on the planet. Among the few personal items eventually recovered from the expedition's documented route is a small pocket chronometer, its hands frozen permanently at one specific moment, its case engraved with the initials of an officer whose full name researchers have never been able to confirm with any real certainty. Instruments like this one were essential to Arctic navigation, calibrated carefully against Greenwich time and checked daily to calculate longitude with any reasonable accuracy. A second chronometer, recovered decades later from a different site along this same general coastline, had stopped at an entirely different time, suggesting it had simply run down once nobody remained alive to wind it each morning. Researchers studying these 2 stopped clocks side by side have used the gap between their final recorded times to estimate, very roughly, how long the expedition's organized structure managed to hold together after the ships were finally abandoned for good. This single page is the last confirmed word any of these 129 men ever wrote. The handwriting in its second half is noticeably less steady than the first, the letters smaller and more cramped, crowded into whatever blank space remained on a sheet of paper that someone was filling out quickly, with cold hands, fully aware it might be the only proof any of them had ever existed at all. It will sit sealed inside a stone cairn for 13 years before anyone finds it, and everything that happened after April 1848 has had to be reconstructed since then through other kinds of evidence entirely. Scattered bones, abandoned equipment, and the testimony of people who actually watched what came next. The men dragged heavy lifeboats mounted on wooden sledges across the broken ice, loaded with supplies and, strangely, with items that made perfect sense aboard a Royal Navy ship and almost none at all on a desperate overland march. Silver cutlery engraved with officers' initials. Books. A writing desk. Curtain rods, of all things, hauled for kilometers across pack ice by men whose bodies were already failing them. One theory holds that this reflected naval discipline rather than confusion, officers following inventory procedure even as their entire world collapsed around them, unwilling to abandon Crown property without proper authorization. Another theory suggests something closer to simple exhaustion, men too weakened by cold and hunger to make clear decisions anymore about what truly mattered and what could safely be left behind. A fully loaded ship's boat, even a relatively small one, could weigh well over half a ton once its provisions and equipment were accounted for. Mounted on a sledge and hauled across uneven, broken pack ice by men whose strength was already failing, that weight transformed what should have been a swift, desperate retreat into something closer to slow, grinding torment. Frozen rope cut into shoulders already raw from days of effort. Boots, however well made back in England, no longer kept feet dry against meltwater pooling on the surface of the ice. And ahead of them, always, lay more ice, with no clear end visible from wherever any of them happened to be standing that particular morning. Skeletal remains scattered across decades of search expeditions, discovered along the western coast of King William Island and the mainland beyond it, tell a story of a retreat that came apart slowly rather than all at once. Groups separated from the main party one by one. Equipment was abandoned in stages, never all together, as though each decision to leave something behind had been argued over and delayed for as long as anyone could manage. They did not get far enough. Searchers would later find one of these boats abandoned at a site now known as Erebus Bay, still strapped firmly to its sledge, containing 2 skeletons and the same strange collection of supplies that should have been left behind on the very first day of the march. The pattern repeated itself again and again along this same stretch of frozen shoreline and onto the mainland beyond it. Groups broke apart from the main party. Men died in 2s and 3s, then increasingly alone. The boats abandoned one after another as fewer and fewer hands remained strong enough to keep pulling them forward. At one particular site along this route, searchers found a row of skeletons spaced almost evenly along the shoreline, as though each man had simply stopped walking the moment his body would no longer carry him any further, and the others remaining had been too weak themselves to do anything but continue on past him without stopping. Naval discipline had trained these sailors, across years of service, to value strict order, careful inventory, and the preservation of crown property above almost everything else, habits drilled deeply into them long before this voyage ever began. Some historians believe this ingrained training, rather than simple panic or confusion, offers the more likely explanation for why men who were visibly dying of starvation continued hauling silverware and curtain rods across broken ice. It wasn't irrational behavior in any simple sense. It was, more precisely, the wrong instinct entirely for the specific situation these men found themselves trapped inside. How many men actually reached the Canadian mainland is still not fully known, even now. Decades of search expeditions, working their way along this same unforgiving shoreline piece by piece, recovered scattered human remains at more than a dozen separate sites, each new discovery adding another fragment to a picture that has never come fully into focus. What is known, with complete certainty, is that none of the 129 men who sailed past Greenland in 1845 ever returned home, and that the people who would eventually hold the clearest picture of how they died were not the British search parties who would spend the next decade looking for them. Inuit families traveling across this same stretch of Arctic coastline encountered members of the expedition, while at least some of the men were still alive, still walking, still trying to drag boats they no longer had the strength to properly manage. Some accounts describe food being offered to these starving strangers. Some describe a gap that neither side could fully cross, not enough shared language between them to explain clearly what was happening or where any real help might be found. Later, the same families found what had been left behind: the abandoned camps, the bodies, equipment scattered across the snow exactly where the last surviving men had finally dropped it and kept walking, or simply stopped. Inuit families traveling and hunting across this same stretch of coastline had no reason to invent any part of what they later described. They gained nothing from the telling beyond the simple unrewarded act of answering honestly when finally asked, year after year, by search parties who arrived expecting confirmation of a heroic story and instead received something considerably harder and more uncomfortable to hear. When British search expeditions eventually arrived in the region, years afterward, asking careful questions through interpreters, it was this Inuit testimony that gave them by far the clearest and most consistent picture of what had actually happened, including the precise location of one ship that had drifted, still afloat and entirely undamaged, long after its crew had abandoned it for good. That testimony also described something the search parties did not particularly want to hear repeated back to them. Signs, described carefully and without exaggeration by multiple separate witnesses, that the very last survivors had cut into the bodies of the dead in order to survive even a handful of additional days. Later researchers, working with properly trained Inuktitut speakers and considerably more patience than the original 19th century search parties typically allowed themselves, have been able to revisit much of this early testimony with far greater care than it originally received. What emerges, once the language barrier is properly and carefully addressed, is testimony that holds together remarkably well across multiple independent tellings, separated by decades and by the real limitations of the original interpreters working under pressure in the field. The American explorer Charles Francis Hall later spent years living directly among Inuit communities specifically to collect and cross-check this testimony, convinced that earlier British search parties had dismissed entirely reliable witnesses out of simple, unexamined prejudice rather than any genuine evidentiary concern. In London, this account was treated less like evidence and more like an insult. Charles Dickens, writing in 1854 in a widely circulated essay, dismissed the cannibalism testimony outright, insisting that British officers and gentlemen would never sink so low regardless of their circumstances, and suggesting, without offering a shred of actual proof, that the Inuit witnesses themselves might know rather more than they were willing to say about what had really happened to the missing men. It is worth remembering that Dickens never once traveled to the Arctic, never met a single Inuit witness in person, and built his entire confident public dismissal on nothing sturdier than his own assumptions about what civilized Englishmen were and were not capable of doing once there was no one left to see them do it. Few British officers of this period spoke any Inuktitut at all, and most communication during these search interviews depended on a small handful of interpreters, themselves often unfamiliar with the specific regional dialect being questioned, working under real pressure to translate detailed, frequently traumatic testimony into English on the spot. Mistranslation almost certainly happened. Nuance was almost certainly lost somewhere between one language and the next. And some of the broader skepticism that met these accounts may have genuinely stemmed, beyond simple prejudice, from garbled translations that made remarkably consistent stories sound, to untrained British ears, considerably more contradictory than they actually were. 3 years is a long time to wait before worry becomes action, especially for an expedition that had explicitly been provisioned for exactly that length of time and slightly more besides. The Admiralty's initial calm reflected genuine confidence rather than simple negligence, a confidence built on Franklin's own considerable experience and on ships that had, by every available measure, been about as well prepared for this specific kind of voyage as any vessels the Navy had ever sent north. Official concern did not begin in London until 1848, 3 full years after the ships had sailed, once supplies should reasonably have started running low and no word of any kind had arrived from anywhere. What followed became one of the largest search efforts in the entire history of exploration. More than 30 separate expeditions, British and American alike, pushed into the Arctic over the following decade, looking for any trace at all of the missing men. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's wife, became the search's single most relentless and most persistent voice, funding ships directly out of her own personal fortune, writing letter after letter to a government she felt had given up far too easily, and refusing for the better part of a decade to accept what the slowly accumulating evidence was already beginning to suggest. It was one of these expeditions, led by Francis Leopold McClintock in 1859 aboard a small steam yacht that Lady Franklin had purchased specifically for this purpose, that finally located the cairn on King William Island and the folded note sealed inside it. McClintock's team also recovered the abandoned lifeboat at Erebus Bay, along with scattered human remains and a substantial body of additional Inuit testimony that, taken together, finally gave the outside world its first real outline of what had actually happened to this expedition. McClintock himself, writing afterward in his official report, admitted a grudging respect for the Inuit witnesses he had personally interviewed, specifically noting that their separate accounts agreed with each other in precise, verifiable detail even when collected years apart by entirely different search parties who had no way of comparing notes with one another. These early sledging parties carried detailed daily journals, and their surviving entries describe a landscape that gave up its secrets only reluctantly, one hard-won mile at a time. Cairns built by earlier search parties, meant to mark safe routes and leave messages for any expedition following behind them, were sometimes found disturbed by passing polar bears or simply buried again under fresh snowfall, their carefully written contents lost before anyone else could properly record them. Relief ships sent out as early as 1848, before anyone fully grasped how dire the underlying situation had already become, left supply caches along the most likely route south, buried beneath marked cairns in case Franklin's crew eventually passed that way after the search ships themselves had been forced to retreat for the coming winter. Several of these caches were later found completely undisturbed, years afterward, by subsequent search expeditions, quiet evidence that Franklin's men had never come anywhere near them at all. This particular search effort, even as it failed again and again across multiple seasons to find any survivors, ended up mapping enormous stretches of the Arctic that had never before been properly charted by any European expedition. In a strange and fitting twist, the long search for Franklin's expedition completed more of the actual geography of the Northwest Passage than Franklin's own original expedition had ever managed to sail in the first place. By the time McClintock finally returned home to England, the basic outline of the very passage Franklin had originally set out to find was, in fact, known and confirmed. It had simply cost 129 lives and more than a decade of searching to learn it. The deeper truth of what had actually happened, the specific conditions these men faced and the choices they were ultimately forced into at the very end, remained only partly understood, and it would stay that way for well over another 100 years before science finally caught up with what the witnesses had been saying from the very beginning. In the 1980s, scientists exhumed the 3 graves at Beechey Island, and what they found waiting inside the permafrost stopped people in their tracks. The bodies of Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain had been preserved so completely by the frozen ground beneath them that their skin, their hair, even their individual facial expressions were still clearly visible after more than 140 years underground. The researchers who opened these graves worked carefully, photographing each stage of the process, fully aware they were disturbing something that had been left entirely undisturbed since 1846. What they uncovered when they finally lifted the ice away from Torrington's face was a young man who looked, in the words of one researcher present that day, as though he had died only the week before rather than well over a century earlier. The scientists who opened these 3 graves in 1984 worked with a kind of quiet, deliberate care that reflected exactly what they understood themselves to be disturbing. Photography first, then careful excavation, every stage documented before a single bone was moved, all of it driven by an awareness that they were the first people in nearly a century and a half to look directly into these particular faces. Tests on these preserved bones and tissue revealed lead concentrations far higher than would normally be expected for men of this particular era, a discovery that launched one of the most widely repeated theories about the expedition's eventual fate. The idea was straightforward. Lead, possibly leaching from the solder used to seal the thousands of tin cans the expedition carried, had slowly poisoned the crew's bodies and minds across the following years, compounding every other hardship they were already facing. It remains a genuinely compelling theory, and it may well have played some real role in what happened. But it is also a theory that stays disputed among researchers today, and any documentary that presents it as settled fact is, frankly, getting ahead of the actual science. Some researchers point instead toward the lead components built into the ship's own freshwater distillation systems, machinery that converted seawater into drinking water and that, if it was the true source, would have meant every man aboard, officers and ordinary sailors alike, was being continuously exposed every single day, regardless of which specific cans of food any particular man happened to eat from. Others note simply that these 3 men at Beechey died early, in the very first winter, well before the worst of the crisis even began, and question how much their elevated lead levels can really tell researchers about what happened to everyone else years later, under conditions that had grown dramatically more severe by comparison. If the ship's lead-lined water systems were indeed the primary culprit rather than the food itself, it would mean every man aboard, officers and ordinary sailors alike, was being exposed continuously, day after day, almost entirely regardless of which specific tins any particular individual happened to eat from. This particular theory has gained considerably more traction among researchers in recent years, partly because it more easily explains lead levels found broadly distributed across the crew rather than concentrated narrowly in specific individuals who might simply have eaten more tinned meat than their fellow sailors. None of these competing explanations fully cancel each other out, and it remains entirely possible that cans, contaminated water systems, and simple decades of background exposure within a heavily leaded 19th century world all contributed something meaningful to the elevated readings researchers keep finding in these recovered bones. The honest scientific answer, repeated by nearly every serious researcher currently working on this question, is that the full picture remains genuinely incomplete. Lead exposure was almost certainly present aboard these ships to some meaningful degree. Whether it was a major contributing factor to the expedition's overall collapse, or a smaller piece of a much larger and more complicated picture that also included starvation, exhaustion, and very likely scurvy as well, continues to be argued over in the published literature, and anyone offering you a single, tidy answer to this question is almost certainly oversimplifying what the evidence actually shows. None of this kind of evidence existed in 1859, or in 1880, or for most of the 20th century that followed either of those dates. It exists now only because researchers eventually went looking for it, motivated in no small part by the accumulated weight of testimony that had been waiting patiently, for well over 100 years, for someone to finally take it seriously enough to actually test. What forensic science could eventually confirm without any real dispute came from a different category of bones entirely, recovered along the documented route of the final overland march. The cuts found on these particular remains were clean and deliberate, consistent with the careful, practiced work of someone using a knife specifically to remove flesh from bone rather than with any chaos of violence between men. Forensic researchers studying these marks decades later noted something almost unbearably ordinary about the underlying technique, observing that it closely matched the kind of routine butchery any ship's sailor would have already learned simply from years spent preparing meat aboard a working naval vessel. What those marks ultimately showed matched, in their broad outline, what Inuit witnesses had been quietly saying for well over a century, testimony that one widely read Victorian essay had once dismissed with complete and unwarranted confidence. Stable isotope analysis, a more recent technique that examines the specific ratio of certain elements that build up gradually in human tissue depending on diet, has allowed researchers to estimate, with genuinely surprising precision, how much of each individual's final diet came from ordinary shipboard provisions and how much may have come from other, far more desperate sources during the expedition's last and most brutal weeks. The results have been quietly devastating to read in the published papers. Several individuals examined this way show isotope signatures consistent with a marked dietary shift in the period immediately preceding their deaths, a change researchers interpret cautiously but consistently as further evidence supporting what the cut marks and the long-dismissed testimony had already suggested. This level of forensic attention exists for a specific reason that goes well beyond simple historical curiosity. For well over a century, the only detailed accounts of what had actually happened to this expedition came from witnesses that British authorities had largely chosen not to believe. Forensic science, once it finally arrived in the 1980s and accelerated steadily through the decades that followed, became a way of testing that long-dismissed testimony against physical evidence that could no longer be waved away as easily as an interpreter's imperfect translation. Each new study published on this question has, with very few exceptions, confirmed rather than contradicted what those original Inuit accounts had been saying all along. This level of sustained forensic attention exists for good reason, well beyond simple historical curiosity for its own sake. Forensic dentistry, careful DNA extraction, isotope analysis, and microscopic examination of bone surfaces under magnification powerful enough to distinguish a deliberate knife cut from ordinary scavenger damage or simple decomposition have together transformed this case from a story told almost entirely through testimony into one increasingly grounded in hard physical evidence that cannot be waved away. Each new study published on this question continues to refine the picture in small but meaningful ways, even as researchers openly acknowledge that some specific details, exactly how many men died in any given week, exactly which individuals made the final choices that kept others alive a little longer, will likely never be fully recoverable from bone alone. however sophisticated the available laboratory techniques eventually become. There is a smaller, quieter mystery still tangled inside this larger one, worth pausing on before we move further north. Researchers diving on the two wrecks have, so far, found no human remains inside either vessel, a gap that raises its own uncomfortable questions about whether the last men aboard each ship died elsewhere, perhaps out on the ice nearby. Their bodies never returned to the ships they had called home for nearly 3 years. Inuit testimony collected across the decades does describe encounters with at least one of these ships after it had already been abandoned, including accounts of finding it still afloat and undamaged, its decks completely empty, and in at least one telling, a single body aboard, wrapped and laid out with what was described as evident care. For more than a century and a half, the two wrecks themselves remained the one piece of this entire story that nobody could manage to find. Search after search, across more than 100 years of intermittent effort, came back from the Arctic entirely empty-handed. Some researchers believed the vessels had simply been crushed by shifting ice and had then sunk somewhere in deep, unsearched water far from any plausible shoreline. Others had quietly stopped believing the ships would ever be found at all, lost beneath a stretch of Arctic seafloor too vast and too remote to ever be properly and thoroughly surveyed using the tools available at the time. Theories about the ship's fate had multiplied across more than a century of failed searching. Some researchers believed the vessels had simply been crushed by shifting pressure ridges and dropped into water too deep to ever properly survey. Others had quietly given up the search altogether, treating the wrecks as effectively unrecoverable, lost somewhere beneath thousands of square kilometers of largely unmapped Arctic seafloor. The eventual breakthrough came from listening rather than from searching blind. Parks Canada's modern search teams worked directly and closely with Inuit communities, deliberately building their search areas around oral testimony that had been carried forward across generations, in some cases passed down almost word for word from one elder to the next. In September 2014, sonar finally located HMS Erebus, sitting upright on the floor of Queen Maud Gulf, in a location that closely matched accounts collected as far back as the 19th century, including one persistent story about a ship seen sinking near a small island that earlier, less attentive searchers had simply passed over without a second look. 2 years later, in September 2016, divers found HMS Terror as well, resting in a quiet bay near King William Island that Inuit elders had identified long before any modern research vessel ever arrived to confirm it. One Inuit hunter, Sami Kogvik, had years earlier seen something strange jutting from the ice during a routine snowmobile trip, an object that struck him immediately as unnatural, though he hadn't been able to identify it clearly at the time and had mostly kept the memory to himself until researchers finally asked. The location he described to the search team matched, within a remarkably small margin of error, almost exactly where Terror was ultimately found resting. The search vessel that eventually found Erebus had been running methodical survey lines for days on end, the sonar operator watching what felt like an endless, empty screen hour after hour, when a shape finally appeared on the seafloor that was simply too regular, too straight-edged at its corners, to be anything naturally occurring. A diving helmet from a much earlier, failed 19th-century salvage attempt was later found resting undisturbed on Erebus's own deck, abandoned there by searchers who had apparently located the wreck briefly decades earlier without ever fully realizing what they'd actually found, then lost track of it again in these same cold waters for another 100 years before modern sonar finally confirmed it for good. Both wrecks turned out to be extraordinarily intact. Cold Arctic water and the complete absence of shipworms had preserved them in a way almost nobody on the search team had genuinely expected going in. Divers found dishes still neatly stacked in their cabinets, bottles of wine still fully corked after more than 170 years underwater, and a captain's writing desk with its drawers closed, as though someone had simply stepped away for a moment and never quite managed to come back. Finding these wrecks did far more than simply close a long-standing historical mystery. It quietly corrected one. For well over 150 years, The single most reliable account of where these ships had actually gone down had come from Inuit oral history, testimony that British searchers across the 19th century had often dismissed, doubted, or simply ignored outright. When sonar finally confirmed what those accounts had been saying all along, it confirmed something else at the very same time. The people who had been disbelieved the longest had, in fact, been right from the very beginning of this entire story. This collaborative model, built specifically to avoid repeating the pattern that defined the first 150 years of this story, has since become something of a reference point for how heritage agencies and indigenous communities elsewhere might approach shared historical sites together. It did not happen automatically or easily. It happened because the wrecks themselves were ultimately found using Inuit knowledge that searchers had, for once, finally agreed to take fully at face value from the very beginning of the search. Today, both wrecks are studied under an ongoing collaborative framework involving Parks Canada and the Inuit Heritage Trust, with Inuit communities directly and formally involved in every major decision about how these sites are explored, what may be recovered from them, and how any artifacts are eventually displayed to the public. Modern archaeologists diving on Erebus and Terror now work under guidelines shaped as much by Inuit cultural protocols as by standard archaeological practice, and some artifacts are deliberately left exactly in place rather than removed, honoring a clearly stated community preference that not everything found on the seafloor necessarily needs to be taken away in order to be properly studied or properly honored. One archaeologist, recalling her own first dive on Erebus, described swimming slowly past the captain's pantry and seeing rows of plates still neatly stacked there, completely untouched by well over a century and a half of cold water, and feeling, in her own words, less like a scientist documenting a historical site and more like an intruder quietly stepping into someone else's kitchen. This sense of intimacy now shapes how both sites are approached. Dive plans are made with deliberate slowness. Artifacts are documented extensively exactly where they lie before anything is even considered for removal, and many objects are simply photographed and carefully catalogued rather than disturbed at all. Divers exploring Erebus have also recovered a sealed wooden box containing carefully wrapped scientific instruments, barometers, and thermometers packed away with a precision that strongly suggests an officer fully expected to use them again the following season. In 2019, divers recovered a sealed glass medicine bottle from the surgeon's quarters aboard Erebus, its cork still firmly in place, its actual contents entirely undisturbed since the day someone last quietly closed that particular cabinet door. Nothing about the way these objects were so carefully stored suggests a crew that genuinely believed, even at this comparatively late stage of the unfolding disaster, that their voyage was already and irreversibly over. That single detail troubles some historians more than almost any other piece of evidence recovered from either wreck, since it suggests that hope, or perhaps simply long-trained naval discipline, persisted aboard these ships well after the broader situation had become, by any reasonable external measure, genuinely unsurvivable. Even now, with both ships found and thoroughly mapped, divers still do not know exactly how many men were aboard when each vessel finally sank, or what those last days actually looked like for whoever remained behind. Some of that, the Arctic may simply never give back, no matter how carefully future searches continue. What both wrecks have already given back, though, is more than enough to finally settle a debate that should never have taken a century and a half to resolve in the first place. It is worth pausing here on the ordinary men who made up most of this crew, because history remembers Franklin's name far more easily than it remembers theirs. Most of the 129 men who sailed past Greenland in 1845 were not officers at all. They were able seamen, stokers, carpenters, and stewards, men mostly in their 20s, drawn aboard by steady Navy pay and the promise of an adventure worth telling their grandchildren about one day, men with families waiting quietly in English ports who would spend years, and in many cases decades, never learning what had actually happened to a son, a husband, or a brother who had simply sailed away one spring morning and never come home again. John Torrington was 20 years old when the Arctic finally took him, the youngest of the 3 men buried at Beachy. John Hartnell was 25. William Brain was 32. Their wooden headboards still stand on that island today, weathered but legible, and their names remain among the very few, out of all 129, that anyone outside a research paper would likely recognize on sight. Francis Crozier, who took command after Franklin's death, was Irish, and from a modest family background by Royal Navy standards, having worked his way up through demonstrated merit rather than through the kind of family connections that smoothed so many other officers' careers in this period. Colleagues who served alongside him across the decades consistently describe a man who listened far more than he spoke, and who treated even his most junior sailors with a level of respect that was not at all universal among commanding officers of his era. James Fitzjames, by contrast, was young and outwardly confident, the kind of officer whose career seemed destined to be just beginning rather than quietly ending on a frozen coastline. He had genuinely believed, right up until the very end, that he would eventually leave behind for good. A steward named William Gibson, listed in the original muster roll with no recorded next of kin at all, left behind almost nothing in the historical record beyond his bare name and his rank. Researchers working to piece together this crew's full identities from scattered remains have increasingly had to rely on DNA matched directly against living descendants who, until very recently, had no idea whatsoever that their own family carried any connection to this expedition. One such identification, confirmed through careful DNA testing on remains recovered from King William Island, matched an engineer named John Gregory, finally allowing his living descendants in South Africa to visit, well over a century and a half after his death, something close to a known resting place for an ancestor who had, for generations, simply existed as a name on an old muster roll and nothing more. Most of these ordinary sailors left almost nothing behind in any official archive beyond their bare name, their rank, and the date they signed aboard. Surviving muster rolls list trades rather than personalities. Caulker, sailmaker, ice quartermaster, stoker, each man reduced on paper to the single skill the Navy had specifically needed from him. Letters home from this period, where they survive at all, tend to be brief and practical rather than introspective, men writing mainly to reassure worried families that pay was being properly sent and that the voyage, so far, remained entirely uneventful, never once imagining these would become among the very last words their families would ever receive from them directly. Surviving pay records show that many of these ordinary sailors had families dependent on the wages the Navy continued to send home throughout the voyage, wives and children in port towns across England, who received regular payments for years after the ships themselves had gone silent, their husbands and fathers already dead on a coastline none of them would ever see or fully understand. These were not abstractions, and they should never be treated as one. They were people, each and every one of them, with their own private reasons for being aboard those particular ships, and their own quiet, largely unrecorded ending somewhere out on that ice. Not commanders. Not the faces preserved in formal naval portraits hanging in London museums. Ordinary sailors who had signed up, originally, for nothing more dramatic than a few years' voyage and a dependable wage, and who never once imagined that the ice would simply decide to keep them. Consider the sheer weight these men were dragging across broken pack ice. A fully loaded ship's boat, even a relatively modest one, could weigh well over half a ton once provisions, equipment, and the boat itself were properly accounted for. Mounted on a wooden sledge and hauled by men whose bodies were already failing them, that weight transformed what should have been a swift, focused retreat into something closer to slow, grinding torment, every kilometer extracting a cost the men's bodies could increasingly no longer afford to pay. No single disaster explains everything that happened to this expedition. It was an accumulation, each individual hardship making the next one considerably harder to survive, until the combination of all of them together finally became impossible to outlast. 2 consecutive winters trapped in ice that should reasonably have released the ships after only one. a coastline that offered almost nothing useful to hunters who had never learned to properly read it. Provisions stretched far beyond anything they were ever originally calculated to cover. Possibly lead, in quantities that remain genuinely debated among researchers to this day. Possibly scurvy, returning despite the lemon juice carried specifically to prevent it, its protective vitamin content perhaps quietly degraded after years sitting in storage, though even this remains an open question rather than a fully settled fact. And finally, for the men who made it onto the ice during that last desperate march south, simple cold and simple exhaustion, doing precisely what cold and exhaustion have always done throughout all of human history, to people who have been pushed well past what any body can reasonably be expected to carry. There was no single moment buried in this story where everything could have unfolded differently. No single decision that, undone, would have brought these particular men safely home again. There was only a slow, steady tightening, winter after winter, until the door that had once stood open quietly closed for good, and by the time the last of these men finally stepped off the ships onto the open ice, the outcome of that march had effectively already been decided long before any of them took their first step. The Royal Navy's own official position on this expedition shifted slowly and rather reluctantly across the 1850s. 4 years, officers and naval families alike clearly preferred to imagine survivors still somehow holding out somewhere in the Arctic, perhaps living quietly among Inuit communities, waiting patiently for an eventual rescue, rather than confront the considerably harder possibility that the entire expedition had simply died. This understandable reluctance shaped the search itself in real and lasting ways. Early expeditions focused their limited resources on areas where survivors might still plausibly be found alive, rather than on the kind of careful forensic recovery work that might have answered the harder, more painful questions much sooner than it ultimately did. The broader Victorian public's appetite for heroic Arctic narratives had been carefully cultivated across decades of earlier, more triumphant expedition accounts, illustrated lectures, and popular engravings depicting brave British officers calmly facing down the frozen wilderness through sheer force of character and discipline. Franklin's expedition had been expected, by nearly everyone following its progress from a comfortable distance, to add one more chapter to that same flattering, familiar story. What it delivered instead was something the public had no comfortable cultural framework for absorbing. Complete failure, total loss, and evidence that the very discipline and restraint Britain prided itself on could collapse entirely once cold, hunger, and isolation had done their slow, patient work for long enough. Even after the discovery of the Cairn document in 1859 made any continued hope of survival a simple mathematical impossibility, the Admiralty's own official report on the expedition remained notably restrained on the subject of the cannibalism evidence, a silence some historians today read as entirely deliberate, a quiet choice to protect the broader reputation of the Royal Navy rather than fully reckon, in public, with what its own carefully selected officers and men had ultimately been driven to do in their final, desperate days. Lady Jane Franklin never remarried, and she spent the remaining decades of her long life deeply and personally involved in causes connected to her husband's legacy, including funding further Arctic research and quietly supporting other explorers' expeditions long after her own husband's fate had finally been confirmed. Her personal papers, preserved today in archives across both Britain and Tasmania, where she had lived for several years before her husband's final voyage, reveal a woman who read every single search report in exhaustive, almost obsessive detail, cross-referencing individual accounts and questioning inconsistencies, behaving considerably less like a grieving widow simply accepting bad news and far more like an investigator unwilling to let any loose thread go unexamined. Lady Jane Franklin's specific insistence on continuing the search year after year, against a backdrop of mounting public and official pessimism, eventually shifted the entire character of the search effort itself, transforming it from a rescue mission into something closer to a sustained, decade-long act of personal and national reckoning with uncertainty. Few widows in this era had the financial independence, let alone the sheer persistence, to fund multiple private expeditions entirely on their own initiative. In one surviving letter, written years before McClintock's eventual discovery, she specifically pressed a search expedition's commander to interview Inuit witnesses far more thoroughly rather than simply dismissing their accounts out of hand, a position considerably ahead of much of the broader British public sentiment at that particular time. Whether this came from a genuine, considered respect for Inuit testimony or simply from sheer desperation to find any usable lead at all, her instincts on this specific point would, decades later, prove to be exactly right. She died in 1875, 16 years after finally learning the full truth, having ultimately spent more years of her own life searching for her husband than she had ever spent actually married to him. She corresponded directly with the President of the United States during these years, lobbied newspaper editors across 2 continents, and commissioned a public monument to her husband years before his fate had actually been confirmed, an act some contemporaries considered prematurely sentimental and others considered simply an act of stubborn, persistent love that refused to wait for official permission. When McClintock finally returned to England in 1859 carrying the Cairn document, it was Lady Franklin who received the news first, in a quiet, private meeting held before any wider public announcement was made. The note confirmed what she had likely feared, in some private corner of her mind, for years already, and had simply never been willing to say aloud to anyone, including herself. The broader 19th-century British public followed this entire saga with an intensity that can be genuinely difficult to fully appreciate from today's vantage point. Newspapers ran regular updates on the various search expeditions for well over a decade straight. Public lectures on Arctic exploration drew large and enthusiastic crowds. A popular stage play depicting a fictionalized version of the search, complete with elaborate ice-themed sets, ran in London for months and was reportedly attended, at least once, by Charles Dickens himself, the very same Dickens who would later so confidently dismiss the one piece of testimony that ultimately proved most accurate of all. This sustained public fascination shaped how the eventual grim truth was finally received once it arrived. A nation that had spent over a decade quietly imagining heroic tales of survival instead found itself confronted with hard evidence of starvation and cannibalism among officers and gentlemen it had been carefully taught to imagine as paragons of British discipline and restraint under any circumstances. That gap, between the story the public clearly wanted and the story the physical evidence actually told, goes a long way toward explaining why so many people in 1854 found it considerably easier to question the witnesses than to honestly question their own comfortable assumptions about what supposedly civilized men would or would not do once there was no one left to see them do it. Climate researchers studying historical Arctic ice records have, in recent decades, examined the precise years of Franklin's entrapment against broader regional patterns of ice cover during the mid-1840s, work made possible by tree-ring data, ice cores, and other proxy records that together allow scientists to reconstruct past climate conditions from long before any direct measurement ever existed. This research suggests the years 1846 through 1848 may have fallen within an unusually persistent cold stretch across the Canadian Arctic, part of a broader period sometimes associated with the tail end of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long era of generally cooler global temperatures that affected ice patterns far beyond just this one expedition's particular stretch of coastline. Researchers have specifically examined the years 1808 and 1809 as well, identifying evidence in ice core records of a separate, still unidentified major volcanic eruption occurring during this earlier period, an event whose climatic aftershocks may have contributed to the broader pattern of unusually persistent Arctic cold that Franklin's expedition would eventually sail directly into nearly 4 decades later. The connection remains speculative, but it adds one more layer to a growing picture of just how unfavorable the underlying climate conditions genuinely were during this specific multi-year window. If this reconstruction continues to hold up under further research, it would mean Franklin's crew was not simply unlucky in any vague, general sense, but was instead caught by a genuinely unusual confluence of precise timing and unforgiving geography, arriving in this exact channel during one of the more severe multi-year ice seasons the region had experienced in decades. It does not change what ultimately happened to them. It does help explain why even a commander with Franklin's considerable experience, planning as carefully as the era reasonably allowed, could not have fully anticipated what these particular waters were about to do to two of the best-prepared ships the Navy had ever sent north. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer who finally completed a full Northwest Passage transit by ship between 1903 and 1906, deliberately studied Franklin's failure before setting out on his own attempt, and built much of his own expedition's overall strategy around avoiding the exact mistakes that had doomed his predecessor decades earlier. Amundsen traveled with a notably small crew rather than a large one, relied heavily on traditional Inuit techniques for clothing, travel, and basic survival rather than purely European methods, and moved at a deliberately slower, more patient pace, willing to winter over multiple times in locations chosen specifically for their proximity to game and fresh water, rather than simply wherever the ice happened to trap him that particular season. Modern climate researchers continue to refine this reconstruction using increasingly sophisticated proxy records, comparing ice core data from Greenland against tree ring chronologies gathered from forests far to the south, building an increasingly detailed picture of exactly how unusual these particular Arctic years actually were compared to the broader multi-decade patterns surrounding them. None of this retrospective climate science was available to Franklin or to the Admiralty in 1845, of course, and none of it could have changed the fundamental decision to attempt the passage that particular year. It exists now purely to help later generations understand, with as much honesty as the evidence allows, exactly how much of this catastrophe came down to genuinely poor luck striking a well-prepared expedition, rather than to any simple failure of planning or judgment on Franklin's own part. His eventual success, 60 years after Franklin's original disappearance, was built directly on lessons the Arctic itself had already been quietly teaching for generations, lessons that had been available, in one form or another, through Inuit knowledge for far longer than the British search effort had ever been willing to properly listen to it, and lessons that had ultimately been paid for, in another and far more permanent form, by 129 lives that never managed to make it home. There is something worth sitting with in the precise timeline of belief that runs underneath this entire story. Inuit witnesses described this expedition's fate with real accuracy within just a few years of the events themselves, in testimony collected as early as the 1850s. Forensic confirmation of the cannibalism evidence did not arrive until the 1990s. The wrecks themselves were not actually found until 2014 and 2016. From the very first telling to full and final scientific vindication, well over a century passed, a gap that says considerably more about who gets believed and why than it says about the actual quality of the evidence itself. Search expeditions in the 1850s relied heavily on sledging parties, small groups of men hauling their own supplies across the ice entirely on foot, covering enormous distances in temperatures that made the basic work itself genuinely dangerous. McClintock's own search, the one that finally found the cairn, involved months of exactly this kind of grinding overland travel, his small team navigating largely the same unforgiving coastline that had already defeated Franklin's crew a full decade earlier. These early relief efforts operated almost entirely on assumption rather than direct evidence, since nobody organizing them in 1848 actually knew where the ships had gone, only where common naval logic suggested a competent crew would most likely choose to retreat. That assumption, reasonable as it seemed at the time, would prove to be one of the costlier miscalculations in the entire search effort, steering early searchers away from the very coastline where the real story was actually unfolding. His own account describes the specific, bitter weather of the day his team finally found the abandoned boat at Erebus Bay, gale winds strong enough to make standing upright genuinely difficult, visibility reduced to only a few meters in every direction. his exhausted men working almost entirely by feel rather than by sight to properly document what they had found before the worsening storm finally forced them to retreat and shelter for the night. The expedition's tinned food deserves a closer look here, because for decades it sat at the very center of almost every popular theory about what had gone wrong. The contractor responsible for supplying these cans, Stephen Goldner, had won the contract on remarkably short notice, just weeks before departure, after the original chosen supplier failed to deliver on time. Cans later recovered from the Beachy Island site showed sloppy soldering in places, thick beads of lead solder applied unevenly along the seams, sometimes close enough to the food itself that direct contact seems entirely plausible. This is part of why the tinned food theory has remained so persistent in popular retellings. It offers a single, photographable, easily understood culprit, even though more recent research has pushed back against treating the cans as any kind of fully settled explanation, since lead distribution patterns found across multiple separate wreck sites appear inconsistent with food being the sole or even the primary source. The 2018 television dramatization of this story, made for a global streaming audience more than a century and a half after the events themselves actually occurred, introduced this expedition to millions of viewers who had likely never heard of Franklin, Crozier, or Fitzjames before sitting down to watch it. The production took clear dramatic liberties in places, weaving in supernatural elements entirely absent from any historical record, but its production team consulted historians and archaeologists closely on the physical details that mattered most. Ship layout, period clothing, the specific texture and sound of the ice itself pressing against a wooden hull through the long Arctic night. The word Kalunit appears throughout Inuit accounts of this entire period, and it carries real weight beyond any simple, literal translation. It does not mean enemy or stranger in any particularly hostile sense. It describes outsiders, people from beyond the known world, encountered the way any isolated, deeply knowledgeable community might reasonably encounter visitors whose customs, language, and apparent helplessness in this exact landscape marked them as fundamentally unprepared for where they had chosen, of their own free will, to travel. Imagine, for a moment, what those final weeks aboard the ships before the eventual abandonment must have actually felt like, in the small, ordinary details rather than only in the broad historical strokes we tend to remember. Candles carefully rationed against a steadily dwindling supply. The particular groaning sound ice makes when it shifts and presses against a wooden hull, a sound men who had already spent 2 full winters trapped inside it would have slowly learned to read for warning signs, the same way sailors elsewhere learn to read approaching weather. Meals growing smaller and noticeably less varied with each passing week, officers and ordinary crew alike quietly watching the same gradual decline play out across each other's faces, the slow hollowing of cheeks, the steady slowing of movement, each man becoming, almost despite himself, a quiet measure of how much longer the rest of them might realistically have left. That gap between officers' tables and ordinary crew's rations likely narrowed considerably, out of sheer necessity, as the entrapment dragged on and supplies grew steadily scarcer with each passing month. By the time the ships were finally abandoned, whatever distinctions had once separated a captain's dinner from a stoker's daily ration had almost certainly dissolved into the same basic, desperate question facing every single man aboard. How much longer would what little remained actually last? A typical day's rations before the entrapment began included salted beef or pork, hard ship's biscuit, a measured ration of flour, dried vegetables when they were available, and a standard daily allowance of rum, a tradition that had changed remarkably little across an entire century of naval service. Officers ate considerably better than ordinary crew, a distinction baked deeply into naval tradition that persisted even here, in the Arctic, far from any formal dining room back in England. Surviving inventory lists describe wine, preserved fruit, and various delicacies reserved specifically for the wardroom table, small comforts that, in the expedition's early and far more confident months, must have made the entire enterprise feel less like genuine hardship and more like an unusually cold but still thoroughly well-provisioned voyage among gentlemen. And somewhere in the middle of all that mounting dread, small, ordinary human routines persisted anyway, the way they so often do even when, perhaps especially when, the larger picture has become too frightening to look at directly for very long. A game of cards played by lamplight. A hymn sung quietly at evening prayer. The kind of small comforts people instinctively cling to even as everything else around them continues, slowly and unmistakably, to fall apart. The Victory Point cairn that eventually held the only written record of this expedition's final months had actually been built years earlier by a completely different search party, originally left standing empty as a simple marker for any future expedition that might pass that way. Franklin's crew, finding it already standing there on the coastline, simply used what was already available rather than building something new of their own, a small detail that meant the single most important document in this entire story very nearly ended up sealed inside the wrong structure altogether, dependent on a cairn none of these particular men had actually built themselves. You can imagine the particular quality of silence in that moment, a silence broken only by wind moving across open ice and by the small, practical sounds of men packing what little remained worth carrying. There was no ceremony to mark the abandonment of two ships that had carried these men safely this far. There was only the next necessary task, and then the one after that. The exact spot where Crozier's men ultimately chose to leave their message happened, by sheer chance, to be one of the more frequently visited stretches of coastline in the entire Arctic search effort, a place searchers were reasonably likely to pass simply because it sat directly along an obvious natural route heading south. Had that note been left somewhere only slightly less convenient, it might never have been found at all, and the outline of this story that ultimately took 13 patient years to assemble might never have been assembled in any recognizable form whatsoever. Inuit communities living across this region had spent countless generations carefully learning exactly how to survive here. Which seal breathing holes were worth the patience of waiting beside for hours. How to build a snow shelter that would reliably hold heat through temperatures that killed unprepared travelers within a matter of hours. When it was safe to keep moving and when it was wiser to simply stay still and wait out a storm. None of that hard-won generational knowledge had been meaningfully shared with Franklin's crew before they ever departed England, and very little of it appears to have been successfully absorbed once the crisis actually began, despite the documented encounters between the two groups that occurred during the final desperate march south. Of the more than 30 search expeditions launched between 1848 and 1859, not a single one was organized from the outset with the explicit goal of asking Inuit communities first, before searching independently at all, what they might already know about the missing men. Every expedition that eventually did incorporate Inuit testimony into its work only did so after months or, in several cases, years of separate, independent searching had already failed to produce meaningful results entirely on its own. This particular sequencing, search alone first, only ask for help once searching alone has clearly proven insufficient, reflects an assumption so deeply embedded in the broader worldview of this era that almost no one involved at the time seems to have questioned it directly or out loud. These identifications continue slowly, year by year, as researchers work steadily through the remaining unidentified remains and as more living descendants come forward voluntarily with DNA samples of their own. Each successful match adds one more individual name back into a story that had, for so long, been told mostly through aggregate numbers and broad statistics rather than through any single, recognizable human life. Among the descendants of expedition crew members, a small but genuinely active community has formed in recent years specifically around researching and honoring their ancestors, made possible largely by the same DNA identification work that has slowly put names back onto previously anonymous remains. Several families, contacted by researchers after genetic matches confirmed a direct connection to specific named crew members, describe a strange and complicated mixture of grief and relief at finally learning, after generations of uncertainty, exactly what had happened to a particular great-great-great-grandfather or distant uncle they had only ever known as an absence in the family tree. The knowledge required to understand this story properly was there from the very beginning, fully available to anyone genuinely willing to ask the people who actually lived along this coastline, in this exact climate, surrounded by this same ice, every single year of their entire lives. It would take the better part of 2 centuries, and the patient, deliberate work of researchers finally willing to listen properly, before that knowledge was treated as the natural starting point it always should have been, rather than as a last resort consulted only once every other available option had already been thoroughly exhausted. The hand organ carried aboard Erebus deserves one final, quiet mention here, simply for what it represents rather than for what it ever actually played. 50 different tunes, wound mechanically into a cylinder, meant to fill the long Arctic darkness with something that at least resembled ordinary life back home. No trace of it has been recovered from either wreck so far. It may still be down there somewhere, in a cabin divers haven't yet fully searched, or it may have been carried off the ship during the final abandonment, dragged across the ice alongside the silverware and the curtain rods. One more strange, heavy comfort that someone simply could not quite bring themselves to leave behind. The ice has not changed. The channels around King William Island still freeze for most of every year, just as they always have. The wind still moves across that exposed coastline the way it did in April 1848, when 105 exhausted men set out walking south, dragging boats they could no longer properly manage, carrying silver they would never live long enough to actually use again. The men gone now have been gone for a very long time, and the specific details of how each one of them spent his final hours have, in most cases, simply been lost to the same cold that took their lives. What remains is the outline researchers have managed to reconstruct, careful and patient, from bone and testimony and rusted tin, an outline that grows a little more complete with every passing research season, but that may never, in certain places, be filled in entirely. Beachy Island still holds its 3 quiet graves, weathered headboards facing a strait that, for one brief and unusually peaceful winter, must have genuinely felt almost calm, before the ships sailed on toward whatever was already waiting for them further west. And beneath the cold, clear water of Queen Maud Gulf and Terror Bay, 2 ships rest exactly where the people who always knew the truth had said they would be found. Decks empty. Holds quiet. Whatever still remains down there, the dishes, the letters, the small ordinary objects that once belonged to 129 separate lives, waits patiently in the dark the way it has waited now for more than 170 years, largely undisturbed, mostly unwitnessed, but never actually lost in the way the rest of the world had so long assumed it was. The men below decks, whose names survive today mostly as entries on a muster roll or as bones identified generations later through careful DNA work, are perhaps the truest center of this entire story. Not commanders. Not the painted faces hanging in naval portraits. Ordinary sailors who signed on for what was meant to be a few years' voyage and a dependable wage, never once imagining the Arctic would simply decide to keep them. Picture the search officer in 1859 who finally opens that folded cairn document with stiff, gloved fingers numb from the cold, a man who has personally spent years of his own life searching for these missing men, only to learn from a single small page that the search itself was effectively over before it had properly begun. That image, more than almost any other in this entire story, captures something essential about how long the truth can sometimes sit waiting in the cold, patient and unread, for someone finally willing to open it. This story carries 2 endings layered quietly inside each other. There is the ending these men themselves actually lived, confidence and quiet ambition giving way, slowly and then all at once, to a landscape that never once cared how well built their ships happened to be, an ending that closed in starvation and in choices nobody watching from a warm, comfortable distance ever really wants to picture in any real detail. And there is a second ending, considerably quieter, running steadily underneath the first the entire time. The people who knew the basic truth from the very beginning of this story were simply not believed, for far longer than they should ever have had to wait. That, in the end, may be the deeper and more lasting tragedy quietly folded inside this entire story. Not only that 129 men once vanished into the Arctic ice, far from anyone who might have saved them in time, but that the people who already knew, with real clarity, exactly what had happened to them had to wait so very long, across so many patient decades, simply to be properly heard. The men are gone now, and have been for a very long time. The truth, in the end, was never actually lost at all. It simply took the rest of the world a great deal longer than it should have to finally sit still and listen. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.